There's something profoundly unsettling about being abandoned, not necessarily by another person, but by the illusion that they would always remain. Because you see, most people aren't prepared for loss, not real loss, not the kind that emerges when someone finally stands up, straightens their back, and decides decisively that they will no longer tolerate ambiguity, neglect, or emotional distance. And that's exactly what happens when you move on. Now, here's the paradox. Because life is full of them, the very individual who could not commit, who hesitated, who kept one foot in and one foot out, suddenly becomes destabilized the moment you withdraw your presence, not because they have suddenly discovered love in its deepest sense, but because the structure that allowed them to remain comfortably detached has collapsed. You were, in many ways, the silent order in their chaos, and when that disappears, chaos rushes in. So when you truly decide to move forward, you're not merely walking away from a person. You are making a declaration that your life will no longer be dictated by uncertainty, that you will not negotiate with emotional inconsistency, that you are, in fact, willing to bear the burden of responsibility for your own future. And that is terrifying, not just for you, but for them, because avoidant individuals construct their lives in a very particular way. They keep intimacy at bay, not because they don't feel, but because they feel too deeply and lack the structure to manage it. So they create distance, predictable distance, safe distance. But when you remove yourself from that equation, when you stop reaching, stop waiting, stop tolerating, they panic because now they are faced with something they have spent their entire lives avoiding, the undeniable consequence of their own inaction. And that is where things become truly interesting, because what follows is not always love. It is often desperation masquerading as clarity. It is urgency disguised as affection. It is the sudden attempt to reclaim what was never properly valued. But you must understand this deeply. Just because someone reacts when you leave does not mean they were ready when you stayed, and that distinction may be the most important lesson you ever learn. There is a deeply uncomfortable truth that most people spend their lives trying to avoid, and it is this: human beings do not truly understand the value of something while it is endlessly available to them. It's a harsh realization. It cuts against our naive assumptions about love, loyalty, and appreciation. We like to believe that if we give more, if we remain patient, if we stay consistent and endlessly present, then surely that will be enough to make someone recognize our worth. But reality does not operate on sentiment. It operates on perception. And perception, as it turns out, is shaped not merely by what is present, but by what can be lost. You see, when something is always there, predictable, stable, unwavering, fades into the background of the psyche, not because it lacks value, but because the mind adapts. It normalizes. It says, this is permanent. This requires no urgent attention. And so attention drifts elsewhere, often toward novelty, toward uncertainty, toward the very things that are not guaranteed. This is not a moral failure at its root. It is a psychological reality. The human nervous system is designed to detect change, not constancy. What remains the same becomes invisible. What threatens to disappear becomes painfully clear. And that is precisely where scarcity enters the equation. Scarcity is not merely about absence. It is about the sudden recognition of finitude. It is the realization, sometimes delayed, sometimes shocking, that something once assumed to be permanent is in fact fragile, temporary, contingent. And when that realization strikes, it reorganizes perception almost instantly. Consider what happens when you truly decide to withdraw your attention from someone who has grown accustomed to it, not in a manipulative sense, not as a strategy, but as a consequence of self-respect. You stop initiating, you stop compensating for their lack of effort, you stop making excuses for inconsistency. At first, there is silence, and in that silence, something begins to shift because the structure they relied on, your presence, your reliability, your willingness to remain, is no longer stabilizing their world. The predictable pattern is broken, and with that break comes uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is a powerful force. It awakens the mind. It demands attention. It forces the individual to confront questions they previously avoided. Why has this changed? Is this permanent? Have I lost something important? Have I lost something important? These are not trivial questions. They strike at the core of human attachment. because when something becomes scarce, it is no longer taken for granted. It is reevaluated. Its importance is recalculated, often with a degree of urgency that was entirely absent before. And this is where things become complicated, because the reaction to scarcity is not always noble. Sometimes it manifests as genuine reflection. A person may begin to see, perhaps for the first time, the value of what they had. They may recognize their complacency, their avoidance, their failure to act with integrity. And in rare cases, that realization leads to meaningful change. But more often, far more often, it manifests as panic. And panic is not the same as growth. Panic is reactive. It is driven by the fear of loss rather than the understanding of value. It says, I don't want to lose this. Not necessarily, I have learned how to cherish this. That distinction is crucial, because when scarcity suddenly increases perceived value, it can create an illusion that the feeling of urgency is equivalent to the presence of love or respect or readiness. But urgency is not the same as depth. Urgency is what happens when something is slipping away. Depth is what exists when something is fully understood and consistently honored. And those two things are often confused, especially in emotionally charged situations. Now, let's take this one step further. When you were consistently available, when your presence was guaranteed, the other person had the luxury of indecision. They could hesitate. They could delay. They could remain in a state of emotional ambiguity because there was no immediate consequence for doing so. Your constancy allowed their avoidance to persist. But the moment you remove that constancy, when you step back and reclaim your time, your attention, your energy, you introduce consequence into the equation. And consequence is what forces clarity, because now, in the absence of your presence, they are confronted with a reality they can no longer ignore, that what they had access to is no longer guaranteed, and that realization can be destabilizing. It disrupts their internal narrative. It challenges their assumptions. It forces them to see the situation not as something static, but as something dynamic, something that can change, something that can end. And when something can end, it suddenly matters. This is the paradox of human valuation. We often fail to appreciate what is stable precisely because it is stable. We assume its continuation. We build our expectations around its permanence. And in doing so, we neglect the responsibility that comes with having something of value, because value, properly understood, demands recognition. It demands tension. It demands care. And when those demands are not met, when value is ignored or minimized, the system eventually corrects itself, not through punishment, but through absence. Absence is a teacher, a brutal one perhaps, but an effective one. It strips away illusion. It reveals what was hidden beneath familiarity. It forces the individual to confront the gap between what they had and what they now lack. And in that confrontation, there is an opportunity for genuine understanding. But here is where you must be careful, because your role in this process is not to orchestrate scarcity as a tactic. It is not to withdraw in order to provoke a reaction. That path leads to manipulation, and manipulation leads to instability. No, your role is to recognize your own value and to act in accordance with it. And sometimes acting in accordance with your value means walking away from situations where that value is not acknowledged. It means accepting the discomfort, loss in the short term in order to preserve integrity in the long term. It means understanding that your presence is not something to be given indefinitely in the absence of reciprocity. And that is not cruelty, that is responsibility. Because when you remain in a situation where your value is overlooked, you are not merely tolerating poor treatment, you are reinforcing it. You are personating in a dynamic that diminishes both you and the other person. But when you step away, when you create distance, not out of spite, but out of clarity, you alter that dynamic fundamentally. You reintroduce scarcity, and with that scarcity comes the possibility of recognition. Now, whether that recognition leads to meaningful change is another matter entirely, because not everyone is capable of transforming panic into growth. Some will react impulsively. They will reach out. They will express urgency. They will attempt to reestablish the connection, but without having addressed the underlying patterns that led to its breakdown in the first place. And if those patterns remain unchanged, then the cycle will simply repeat. Availability will return. Value will again be taken for granted. And the illusion of permanence will once again obscure the reality of fragility. So the question is not merely whether someone reacts when you become scarce. The question is whether they have developed the capacity to sustain appreciation when you are present, because true value is not something that appears only in absence. It is something that is recognized and honored in presence. And that requires maturity. It requires self-awareness. It requires the willingness to confront one's own shortcomings and to take responsibility for them. Without that, scarcity may trigger a reaction, but it will not produce transformation. And so as you move forward, you must anchor yourself in a D, upper understanding. Your value does not increase because you become scarce. Your value was always there. Scarcity simply reveals it to others, and perhaps more importantly to yourself. Because when you are willing to walk away from what diminishes you, you are making a statement, not to them, but to your own psyche. You are saying, I will not participate in my own devaluation, and that is where real power lies, not in controlling how others perceive you, but in refusing to remain where you are not truly seen. There is a fundamental structure underlying all human existence, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And that structure can be understood as the tension between order and chaos. Order is what is known. It is stability, predictability, the set of patterns and agreements that allow life to function without descending into confusion. Chaos, on the other hand, is the unknown. It is uncertainty, possibility, disruption, and transformation. It is where things fall apart, but also where new things emerge. Now, this dynamic does not merely exist in abstract philosophy. It manifests itself quite concretely in your relationships. Every relationship you have is, in essence, a negotiation between order and chaos. At the beginning of any meaningful connection, there is a significant degree of chaos. Two individuals, each with their own histories, fears, desires, and assumptions, come into contact. There is uncertainty, there is exploration. There is the question, often unspoken, of whether something stable can be built from that initial unpredictability. And over time, if things progress, order begins to emerge, patterns are established, communication becomes more predictable, roles, expectations, and boundaries, whether consciously defined or not, start to take shape. There is a sense of familiarity, a rhythm, a structure that allows both individuals to navigate the relationship without constantly questioning its foundation. That is order. And order, when properly maintained, is not oppressive. It is stabilizing. It provides a framework within which trust can grow. It allows vulnerability to exist without overwhelming individuals involved. It creates a shared reality, something both people can rely on. But here is where things become complicated, because not everyone relates to order in the same way. Some individuals crave it. They seek clarity, commitment, defined roles, and consistent behavior. They are willing to take on the responsibility required to maintain that structure, even when it becomes difficult. Others, however, are far more comfortable in chaos, not because chaos is pleasant, it often isn't, but because it is familiar. It allows for distance. It avoids the weight of responsibility. It provides an escape from the demands of stability, from the expectations that come with being fully present and accountable in a relationship. These individuals often oscillate between moments of connection and withdrawal. They move toward intimacy and then retreat from it. They engage and then disengage. And in doing so, they maintain a state of controlled instability, a balance of sorts, but one that leans heavily toward chaos. Now, if you find yourself in a relationship with someone like this, you are placed in a very difficult position, because in order to sustain the connection, you may begin to compensate. You may provide more structure, more consistency, more effort. You become the stabilizing force, the one who maintains order while the other person drifts in and out of it. At first, this may even feel meaningful. You may interpret your role as necessary, even noble. You are the one holding things together. You are the one ensuring that the relationship does not collapse under the weight of its own inconsistency. But over time, something begins to erode, because order cannot be maintained unilaterally. A relationship is not a structure that one person can uphold indefinitely while the other avoids responsibility. that imbalance creates strain. It generates resentment, exhaustion, and eventually disillusionment. And yet you may persist. Why? Because the moments of connecting when they do appear, are powerful. They offer a glimpse of what the relationship could be if only the chaos could be reduced, if only the other person would fully step into the structure with you. But that if is where many people become trapped, because they are not dealing with what is, they are dealing with what could be. And in doing so, they remain in a dynamic that slowly destabilizes them. Now, consider what happens when you finally decide to step out of that role, when you stop compensating, when you stop overextending yourself to create order in a system that resists it, when you withdraw your effort, your attention, your willingness to hold everything together. At that moment, the fragile balance that existed begins to collapse, because what you were maintaining was not true order. It was an artificial stability dependent entirely on your input. And when that input is removed, chaos is no longer contained. It expands. For the individual who was accustomed to avoiding responsibility, this is deeply unsettling, because now they are faced with the full force of the chaos they had previously kept at a distance. The unpredictability intensifies. The absence of structure becomes undeniable. And perhaps most importantly, they can no longer rely on you to shield them from the consequences of their own avoidance. This is where panic often emerges, not because they have suddenly become fully aware of your value in a deep, integrated sense, but because the system they depended on has broken down. They feel the loss of stability. They experience the discomfort of uncertainty. And they may attempt, often urgently, to restore the previous dynamic. But here is the critical point. Restoring the previous dynamic is not the same as creating genuine order, because genuine order requires participation from both individuals. It requires mutual responsibility. It requires a willingness to confront discomfort, to establish boundaries, to communicate clearly, and to remain consistent even when it is inconvenient or difficult. Without that, any attempt to reestablish the relationship will simply recreate the same imbalance, the same cycle, the same oscillation between brief moments of connection and prolonged periods of instability. Now, from your perspective, this is a moment of decision, because when chaos rises, when the other person reacts, reaches out, attempts to pull you back into the dynamic, you may feel a strong pull to return. After all, the chaos is uncomfortable for you as well. You may have grown accustomed to your role as the stabilizer. You may feel a sense of responsibility, even guilt, for the disruption that has occurred. But you must understand something fundamental. You did not create the chaos. You revealed it. It was always there, beneath the surface, masked by your effort, your consistency, your willingness to carry more than your share. And now that it is visible, you have a choice. You can step back into the role you once played, reestablishing the artificial order and allowing the cycle to continue, or you can stand firmly in your decision to move forward, even in the face of discomfort, and require something different, something real. Because real order is not maintained through sacrifice alone. It is built through alignment. It emerges when both individuals are willing to participate in the structure of the relationship, to uphold it, to protect it, and to take responsibility for their part in it. And that kind of order is not fragile. It does not collapse the moment one person steps back. It is resilient. It is sustainable. It allows for growth, for depth, for genuine connection. But it is also rare because it demands a level of maturity that not everyone is prepared to reach. And so as you navigate this dynamic, you must anchor yourself in a clear understanding. Chaos will always exist. It is an inherent part of life, of relationships, of growth itself. But the goal is not to eliminate chaos entirely. The goal is to integrate it into a stable structure, to create a balance where uncertainty does not dominate, where it does not erode the foundation of the relationship, but instead contributes to its evolution. And that requires courage, the courage to face uncertainty without collapsing into it, the courage to establish order without becoming rigid or controlling, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to walk away from situations where that balance is not possible. Because in the end, the question is not whether you can hold a relationship together through sheer effort. The question is whether the relationship as it exists is capable of becoming something stable, something meaningful, something real, something real? And if the answer to that question is no, if the chaos consistently outweighs the order, if the responsibility remains uneven, if the structure cannot be sustained without your constant intervention, then the most responsible action you can take is not to fix it, it is to leave it. Not out of bitterness, not out of resentment, but out of a commitment to something higher, a life that is not defined by instability, but by clarity, a connection that is not sustained by imbalance, but by mutual strength, a structure that does not collapse under pressure, but endures because it is built consciously and carefully by two people who are willing to carry it together. In the end, when you choose to move forward, you are not merely leaving a person behind, you are aligning yourself with truth. Scarcity reveals value, and chaos exposes what was never stable to begin with. The reaction you provoke is not the measure of your worth, but the reflection of what was unacknowledged. And so the real task is not to look back at who panics when you leave, but to move ahead with the discipline to never again where your presence must be diminished to be understood.